right. Well, welcome everybody to episode 5 of the Interdisciplinary podcast. That's not our name. We are the Interdisciplinary History Podcast. I should know that.
Do we want to go do that again?
No, this stays in.
This stays in? Okay. I'm Victoria.
And I'm Sloan, and I swear I know what podcast I'm on.
It's okay. Sometimes we all forget what podcasts we're on.
So, today we are going to be doing a movie review / discussion of the recent adaptation of David Copperfield.
Called The Personal Life and History of David Copperfield.
Not, as I continually got wrong in the prep for this episode, Great Expectations. Victoria was kind enough to inform me that David Copperfield is not a character in Great Expectations, but in fact his own book.
He's a bit of his own person, but...
Yeah, I don't know where I got that from and why I struggled so hard to just get it when we were doing this.
But I think I'll get a little bit into this, that there is a bit of mixture, Great Expectations in there, but that could also just be Charles Dickens being Chucky D.
Yeah, and I guess the reason behind us doing this episode is not only that we both saw the film and really enjoyed it and thought it was a really good adaptation, especially for writing a Dickensian historical film in 2020. Also because I told Victoria I would not do A Christmas Carol, so we picked something else Charles Dickens.
I'll get you one day. I'll get you one day, Sloan. And you're just gonna... You know what I think we should do? I think we should do a Muppets Christmas Carol.
No.
And discuss it in the most serious manner.
Like,
I think,
no.
Yes. Yes.
No.
Yeah.
No. We have done David Copperfield. This is our compromise as creative partners. We don't need more than one Dickens episode in, like, the first year that we do this podcast.
It's okay. It'll happen maybe year 2, year 3. I just need to talk about Kermit the Frog. I need to talk about Michael Caine, Ebenezer Scrooge.
I suppose we should get into it. Obviously, we are both on our respective holiday breaks from school, so we are hoping to keep a little bit more of the fun banter in. So, Victoria, thoughts on this film that you suggested?
I really enjoy it. I read David Copperfield a long time ago.
Alright, so for David Copperfield, you're gonna have some notes, I'm gonna have some notes. Are you gonna be talking more about the adaptation or more about the source material?
I'm gonna talk about it more as like a film.
Okay.
Because it does deviate quite a bit from the novel, but I think, of course, like with time constraints, it has to be shorter, and you have to move certain things around, cut certain scenes.
Yeah.
To make things fit.
For sure.
And I think I'll get into that in the show. I've been revisiting David Copperfield by listening to the Richard Armitage audiobook on Audible. Very good.
Not sponsored.
10 out of 10 would recommend.
Not sponsored.
Not sponsored. I just like Richard Armitage's voice. And this is me sponsoring his voice. Mine.
To be clear, this is Victoria sponsoring. Apparently, not our podcast.
I am sponsoring Richard Armitage on my podcast.
No, I didn't agree to that.
No, fine. I'm just saying, he's great. North and South, wonderful. David Copperfield, really good audiobook. Anyways,
we should probably get into the actual topic of this episode and, stop apparently sponsoring people. I don't know how that works. Are you giving him money?
I'm giving him a platform with my voice.
Audible's giving him a platform. That's not a sponsorship. That's maybe an endorsement. Either way, just okay, good stuff. Why don't we talk about the movie, the personal history of David Copperfield?
As for like the cast in this whole film, I think it was incredibly well cast in general. Everyone seemed like they were enjoying themselves and not taking themselves too seriously. I think Dickens, people tend to take themselves too seriously. They go, this is very highbrow entertainment. With reality, Dickens was like, he was trying to write for everyone.
I think that Dev Patel did a really good job in the lead role as the title character of this film. I really liked the way he interacted with the scenery, and I really liked the way he was able to kind of walk that line between a very historically accurate depiction of kind of even just the body language and the mannerisms of a gentleman without ever alienating the audience.
Yeah.
I felt like he was a really good touch point for kind of the Victorian or Dickensian world that we're dropped into.
He has a very charismatic screen presence. He has really good chemistry with all the cast members, and it looks like he would be a fun person to work with. Like, speaking as an actor, like, he just gives a lot in each scene that he's in. I think he's wonderful as David Copperfield, and I want to see him in more period dramas because of that. I just need to see Dev Patel in everything. I think he should be in every single stuff.
And I think saying that that point about writing for everybody, and this being a film that I think was geared more towards a general audience rather than the audience that is already gravitating towards period dramas, I think that is really relevant. Something that I hope we can speak to in this episode, just because I found some really interesting articles talking about his writing being for both audiences and the fact that adaptations typically treat him like he's only for one audience.
Treat him like people want to treat Shakespeare. And once again, Shakespeare, he was writing for everyone. He wasn't just speaking to the nobility.
And, I mean, Shakespeare should not be taken seriously. If anyone wants to look up why the play is called Much Ado About Nothing and the double entendre that's there...
Honestly, people need to talk more about, like, the double entendres in Shakespeare when you're in, like, high school, because I think that would get kids' interest more than, like, yes, this play is really cursed.
So... we were talking a moment ago about casting.
I was just saying the energy of this cast really does feel like a Dickens novel adaptation should, because I remember like reading books by Dickens, and he has a really fun sense of humor, but no one who does an adaptation of it really understands it. It's like they read the Dickens novel, but they didn't read it aloud.
And I think that that's very connected to sort of just modern perceptions of the Victorian era as being characterized entirely by repression. Repression of humor, repression of sexuality, repression of fun, all of those sorts of things. I think the other thing that we have to say about this cast, and really just a tip off to everybody involved in the casting process, a tip off to, I guess, the filmmaking process, or I don't know the industry terms, the representation in this cast is phenomenal, and I think really shows...
It is.
Just how... I think that we have kind of the perception that historical fiction needs to be cast a certain way, and I think this movie very strongly demonstrates that you don't have to follow those casting norms, those casting conventions, or that if you put a person of color into a historical fiction or a historical drama, you do not have to make the fact that they're a person of color be their entire character trait. So I think that adapting a Dickensian novel and having Dev Patel and I don't know the name of the actress who plays Agnes. She was phenomenal, and I would like more of her in period dramas.
She was so good. Let me just see. I'm looking her up. Rosalind Elazar. She was amazing. She was also just gorgeous, and in all the costumes they put her in, I was just like, oh, she's pretty. Anyways, I like the way that they cast this, because they actually did it in a way that I feel like history actually looks like, not like the BBC's whitewashed version of history that everyone's just come to assume history was actually like.
Yeah, and I think that without making it a story about... How do I want to phrase this? I think it's fair to say that even though certainly there was a great deal of Victorian racism, you could tell a story in the Victorian era that didn't necessarily have to be the primary struggle.
Yeah.
So I think the film did that really well. You really can't go wrong with casting inclusivity. It's better. It's so much better.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. I'm glad we're seeing more of it.
Cool. So Victoria, you being a bit more familiar with the novel, I think we have two things we mostly want to cover, and we've already kind of dipped into the one that this film adaptation is historical fiction in addition to the fact that it's, the adaptation of a classic book. So, which themes do you want to tease out first?
Well, I think I'm gonna mention, that I'm gonna acknowledge is the fact that David Copperfield is big. And like many big books, it's hard to condense it into a film format. Like with miniseries, we have a little bit more time to allow these sort of things to breathe and move. But I think that the way that they condensed David Copperfield in this was really effective, and I really liked it. The way that they changed the Murdstone's plotline, like instead having David go early as a way to sort of toughen him up.
Can you give a quick summary of movie versus book for our listeners who haven't heard?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the movie, Murdstone marries David's mother. He does not like David from the get-go. He and his sister Jane are trying to basically take over David's home life and stuff, and then they send him to a bootblacking factory. In the book, David goes to school beforehand and he meets Steerforth before, and then when his mother dies, that's when Murdstone sends him to the bootblacking factory. So Charles Dickens was actually, his family was sent to debtor's prison, and he was forced to work in a bootblacking factory under terrible conditions. And David Copperfield kind of has this essence of some bit of biographical information has been being woven into the text of the novel. And I think that the way that they changed the Murdstone and David plot lines so that they condense it down was actually pretty effective. I think that in adaptations, it's okay to condense as long as you're getting the essence of the material down.
Mm-hmm. I kind of want to pick it up from what you were saying about there being these biographical elements. And as far as the biographical elements that are in there, there's a really good article that I came across by Kathy Caruth. It's a 2017 article called Language and Flight, Memorial Narrative and History in David Copperfield. So I think it's very important to look at a novel or a piece of literature from the past and recognize that it does have some of those elements of being a primary source, whether it's specifically biographical, whether it's inspired by the biography of somebody or a real person, or just the fact that it's set in the contemporary of when it's written. Mm-hmm. So what Kathy Caruth is getting at in her writing is she's talking about how there's actually two orphans' experiences that you need to draw out of Dickens' work. There's the fictional orphan, David Copperfield, and everything that's being told to you through the eyes of David Copperfield or through kind of the omniscient third-person narrative. But also recognize that she has a really good quote that I might just read out. As the text that presents itself as both the fictional autobiography of the main character, parentheses, David Copperfield, and the autobiographical fiction of its author, Charles Dickens. And I think that that's really well stated in terms of how we approach a book like this and the film adaptation, which is giving you a window into not events that specifically happened, but into a general course of life events that we experience. Something that this film does really well is using scenery and background characters to show what's going on.
Yes, I agree. I think that all the background characters were really well done, and they helped to sort of make up this painting of David Copperfield, because you need all the different elements to make up a painting. Without all these wild and vibrant characters that Dickens has, you can't really appreciate the whole story as a whole. What I noticed in the film is that there are certain elements that they use visually as a way connecting the story of David Copperfield to the story of Dickens. In the scenes where David is writing his story down, he's looking at himself in the mirror and making faces. And that was something that Dickens was known to do. If you've seen The Man Who Invented Christmas, this is shown pretty well, is that he was often standing right in front of the mirror, acting out every single scene.
Talking about this as historical fiction. I think despite the fact that, and I think what's important to approaching this as a piece of historical fiction to learn from is to, even though there's some autobiographical stuff in this, to not treat it like a great man history. Charles Dickens becomes a wildly successful author, and it's implied that David Copperfield goes on to also be a writer and be highly successful in that. that's not super interesting or significant to understanding a period of history or understanding the past. So I think there's elements in this movie that come through really well that do speak more to a social history. And we talked a little bit earlier about how Dickens is usually, in modern adaptations or in the modern lens, read as a very adult novel. But in his own time period, he's writing something that's really more geared for all audiences.
He was the Stephen King of his time.
Yeah. Like, Hannah Field writes a really good article that might actually have been somewhat influenced by this movie because she's looking at adaptations, and it was published on December 1st, 2020. So maybe not. It's hard to say. She may have been aware that something was in the works. Obviously, publishing times are strange. But something that she looks at is, so she uses a few different terms. She uses cross-writing, crossover writing, mixed age, and dual address. Meaning this is a book meant for young people and mature people. And something that she says that I think is really interesting. Like, Dickens' depiction of the factory is intended to be read both by someone who may never have spent time in the factory and is now an adult, someone who has spent time in the factory as an adult, and also quite possibly by someone who is spending time in the factories. That's really significant, and I feel like that's one of those aspects that gets lost a lot in historical fiction, is you have the lower classes, or you have the young people, or you have anybody who's treated more like a backdrop. And something that I feel like this adaptation does really well is avoiding that pitfall. Aunt Betsy is a fantastic character, but something that's very interesting about the way Aunt Betsy is portrayed is Aunt Betsy belongs to what we might, in kind of a modern sociological lens, refer to as the sandwich generation. She's got younger family members who are dependent on her, but she's also got Mr. Dick, who is a older, certainly past his prime, and certainly very dependent on her character. And the sandwich generation is definitely something that becomes more prevalent during the Industrial Revolution, that you have kind of that person who is perhaps of age to be a parent and has kids that they're dealing with, also having dependence of the older generation. And that comes from better nutrition, with industrialization leading to longer lifespans. But it's also really closely tied to kind of the advent of childhood, which we do connect period of industrialization.
We begin to see children as not as little adults, but as actual like young things, that they're growing to eventually be adults.
Yeah, I did a fantastic course a couple of semesters back now. I won't reveal how long I've been an undergraduate student. Dr. Alana Krevsky of McEwen University runs a course occasionally that's History of Children and Childhood.
Yeah, so Dr. Krevsky talks about how with the Industrial Revolution, in comes this idea that children should be taken care of, that they shouldn't just be forced to go work right from the age of 3 or run around in the streets, that they should be taken care of. And with that comes the advent of education and so on and so forth.
Yeah, public education at this time is a fascinating thing, because I think that we have, this isn't really very well related to David Copperfield, I think that we have this perception that, like, people are becoming educated and then they start campaigning for suffrage. It's the complete opposite. It's male suffrage gets passed, there's some expansions on that depending on wealth, income, then public education acts come in. And I find that to be so fascinating that we kind of have that mistaken perception. Getting back to Dickens and to kind of Dickensian works as understandings of the Victorian era society. Dickens is producing works meant to be read by the broad, lower to middling class, and about the broad, middle to lowering class. He's publishing periodicals that come out in broadsheets, and for those reasons, I think his work, understood in its context, can be very powerful. At the same time, Dickens, in his own way, is perhaps a little bit responsible for why he kind of loses his crossover status. Because Dickens is, without a doubt, a part of the Victorian child savers movement. He is. He is campaigning hard, he is fundraising, he is doing all of that. And one of the things that comes out of that is sort of a renewed interest in protecting, in paternalism, in a paternalistic state, which in no way is a bad thing. Social welfare is good, people. But he, in that way, does kind of remove some of the space for crossover works like his own. And then either his granddaughter or grandniece, Angela Dickens, actually ends up publishing children's adaptations of his work. And that certainly has kind of that reinforcing body that if there's one specifically for children, clearly the other one isn't.
Dickens is a very fascinating person. He liked children, but when they grew up, he kind of lost interest in them. This is sort of seen with his children. He married off his daughters quite quickly and kind of ignored his sons. Dickens is a fascinating figure, and he's a very flawed person. I think that too often that he's seen as like this sort of grandfatherly type of guy who was just charming and a good person, but even though he advocated for a lot of good causes, he was still not a great person. This can especially be seen with the situation with his wife when he tried to get her institutionalized so that he could be with his mistress. When I read classic literature, I have to think there are good bits in the literature and then there are bad bits. And I think you also have to think about that with the authors. People are like, so like there was this great work that came out of it, but yeah, there's a lot of issues within that. Dickens is quite a sexist person, I have to say, in a lot of his pieces. Like you especially see that with the character Dora. He definitely said some quotes that I think are definitely indicative of a racist person and like someone who believes in and profits in the effects of imperialism and colonialism, especially in India.
We do know that for a lot of his career, Dickens was an abolitionist. So I think that when we look at a historical piece like this that is very much written from a standpoint of inclusivity, we know that Dickens was very class conscious in his writings. He was very conscious of the fact that his works were being read across the classes through their broadsheet format. Somebody who I think does some really great writing on this, and I would encourage our listeners to seek out if this is something you're interested in, is Grace Moore. Writes a book called Dickens and Empire, Discourses of Class, Race, and Colonialism in the Works of Charles Dickens. It's in the 19th Century series by Routledge, and it came out relatively recently in 2016. And one of the things that she talks a lot about is, despite the fact that Dickens was an abolitionist throughout most of his career, somewhat being accredited to his starting writing as a parliamentary reporter during the debates of abolition, Dickens, in a lot of ways, is certainly campaigning for greater equality, but he doesn't necessarily always hit the mark on being a progressive. Like, he is bound to his time period, which is the worst excuse ever you can give for anyone's historical prejudice. But yeah, like, Dickens is certainly a part of forming British national identity, and in a lot of his nonfiction work that deals with history. Obviously, he's always been interested in writing to children. He writes a book called A Children's History of England, which is predictably incredibly nationalist, incredibly eccentric, and rather teleological. That being said, I don't think that... So I think the reason I'm bringing this up is I really liked this adaptation because it got away from a very white-centric historical fiction, but I don't want us to then perceive Dickens as being more progressive than he was. He, for the most part, like, he does have lots of nonfiction writings that are against slavery. He is absolutely an abolitionist in a lot of what he does. But he, nonetheless, is prone to using things like the noble savage kind of storytelling device, which is pretty bad. So, it's interesting. I think that this is a good adaptation that kind of helps to get away from that on some levels. I think, as Vic has kind of talked about, is not being stuck in a version of the past that's very white is good. I think that the thing that's very much in line with kind of what we know about Dickens' personal politics through his nonfiction writings, and that's the other thing, is we in Canada and probably the US, we tend to consume Dickens through his nonfiction. That's how we become acquainted with him. That's how he's taught in the schooling systems. He does have a absolutely prolific body of work in nonfiction. Something that I found very interesting as I was delving into this, and another great article I would recommend, is Sean Perchance writes a article, I will have to link it below because I don't have the title in front of me right now, talking about how Dickens sort of chooses not to comment on the United States situation in his visits there prior to the Civil War, and also that Dickens does, and this is something Grace Moore notes as well, is that Dickens is not immune to the so-called scientific racism and the perspectives of an evolution that are very, very prevalent, have been widely disproven, like, let's acknowledge that, but the way that that's experienced in this time in the Victorian era.
Going back to the adaptation, I think I have to say is that they didn't talk about Aunt Betsy's trauma more. So close to the end, they talk about how she was beaten by her husband. At the beginning of the novel, the reason why she is so fervent on David being born as a girl and that he's named after her is that so there could be a girl named Betsy Trotwood who doesn't make the same mistakes as she did, which is marrying a man who abused her, and that she eventually was able to divorce and escape from. And she eventually becomes her own independent person who financially and physically supports David and Mr. Dick. And I kind of wish that they'd talked about that more. But what I do appreciate is the fact that there is this scene where Betsy is talking to Dora. And Dora is the person who, in the movie, David is just engaged to. In the book, he does end up marrying her. She goes, "You're just so very young, and you might not be well matched." And Dora's like, "No, we're really good together." When you're watching the film, it's actually kind of jarring to see Dora because she's just a carbon copy of David's mother. She's played by the same actress, but she's played even more childishly, which in the novel, David's mother was just barely 20 when she married David's dad, who was 2 times her age. I think the portrayal of Dora was really effective in showing how wrong her relationship with David actually is. Because I think in most adaptations, like, they would make Dora to be this beautiful waifling of a thing, and then only reveal after the marriage that she and David are wrong for one another. I think that the fact that from the get-go, they used the same actress they used for David's mother to make it feel icky and weird. I think that's fantastic. And the actress, she's very good at differentiating the characters because plays David's mother a bit more reserved. And with Dora, she plays it like a child, and I think that's really, really well done. They also did that with, I think the costuming also was effective in showing that. The costuming in this film was really good, but with Dora, I liked the way how they framed her as this angelic looking child. Like, she had like this cheruby look to her, like with the really springy curls and stuff, which made her look super young. And I think that helped give the effect of youthfulness and also how young she really is when she decides to make this choice and get herself engaged to David.
See, and that's actually something that I think comes through in this adaptation really well, kind of from your description there, is we have Agnes, who ends up being the love interest that he ends up with. Something that I think is really well done about that, to keep it, I guess, kind of in the context of this Victorian era, Agnes is certainly indicative of the new woman. She is educated, she has these career skills, she has some dynamics. So, on the one hand, you could read it from a modern audience and you could be like, oh, well, she's only there to be useful to David, she saves David's, reputation and his money in the last moment, and that's why they end up together. And in the modern lens, you could view that as a very kind of diminishing way to cast, diminishing role for a woman is she proved herself useful, she's the one he married. But understanding it within the context of a Victorian adaptation or the Victorian period, her having all those skills is really progressive. She certainly represents the better side of where things are going. So I quite liked that.
I did too.
I felt that that was good. And I think that, as an audience, certainly we don't think that Dora is a role model. I think as a modern audience member, I'm a bit annoyed that characters like her would still be written. So I have to remind myself that this is an adaptation. But there is kind of this sense that I don't know how I want to phrase this.
So in the book, David ends up marrying Dora, and he's dismayed at figuring out she is a bad housekeeper, and he's essentially married a child. And when she dies, when he eventually marries Agnes, you sort of see this difference in the fact that Agnes is a good housekeeper, but she's also a bit more of an equal with David. In the movie, they really get at that with, like, the fact that Dora and David are not a good mix. I liked in the fact that in the movie he respects her wishes, and that she's like, write me out of it, write me out of the story, because it's not me in here. And that's when he eventually has this revelation that he's in love with Agnes. I think that they did that really well in the fact that loving someone is different when they're equal, and it's different from infatuation, which is something that often people in the Victorian era had to deal with. Like, so they'd be infatuated with this person for a little while, and then they married them really, really quickly, and they didn't get a chance to get to know them, and that's why so many unhappy marriages happened, is because of that. Whereas you see with, like, David and Agnes, they kind of grow up together, and they get to know one another, and while he initially sister zones her, they grow into their love for one another, and I think that this adaptation really does that well.
I think that this adaptation shows, and it would be kind of egregious to simplify things down into saying, oh, the two courtship styles of the Victorian period. But the later Victorian period does have that mix of both a very classical, how do I want to phrase it? A very classical kind of pure, reserved woman, protected by layers upon layers of manner and courtesy, and it's a very structured proposal that's got a lot of social rituals around it, but it's very much, her value is beauty and whatever dowry she has. And I think that Agnes, in addition to being shown as the new woman who's got actual applicable skills, oh my god!
She's a secretary, and she does investigation. I love her.
Yeah, but the other thing is we see that she is not just waiting in the wings for David, which I think is so important to kind of, dispel the belief that women got agency during the Second World War.
Yeah. I think
that's
so good.
She has skills. She is not being shown as in any way improper or scandalous for the fact that she is receiving courtship from other men, which I think would kind of come through in other adaptations, that David might be a little off-put by the fact that she was receptive to Uriel, which personally I think being off-put by Uriel is a good move.
I think also we should talk about how Aunt Betsy and Peggotty and Agnes are central to David's growing up, because he's surrounded by all these strong women. Peggotty is kind, and she sort of teaches him how to be a charitable person, and Tilda Swinton's character, Betsy, she encourages that more, and as well as wants him to make better choices than she did. Even though he is not the girl she initially wanted, she is still giving him the chance to have a better life than her, even though her life at her house with Mr. Dick seems pretty idyllic. Even though there is a ton of donkeys, and it's pretty funny. Dev Patel is chasing after donkeys with a pot and pan. It's great. That's a really good, fun scene. But I just like the way how this film treats the strong females in David's life.
I can't speak to the book, but obviously I know of Dickens and I've done a couple of courses related. The thing that really stuck with me in this movie, while central to the plot, the title character of this movie is not who we've talked about so far. And I think that that's why kind of Dickens' work, and particularly this adaptation of Dickens' work, is so interesting as a work of historical fiction, because you're being introduced to a lot of different characters who speak to different Victorian experiences.
Yeah. I think I had a really good literature professor, and she really explained it well to me that Victorian and Regency novels were written during a time when literacy was just beginning to rise. So when people did read, they would read aloud so that everyone else could enjoy the story. When I watched this movie, I was like, they read this aloud. Mm-hmm. They read the book aloud. Mm-hmm. Because they get this sort of subtle humor, or really crazy humor in David Copperfield. George Eliot does this book called Silas Marner. I read it and I loved it, but my teacher said, you won't get it unless you read it aloud. You have to read it aloud at certain points because otherwise you're not going to get the humor. So when you're reading it aloud like this, it allows for people to connect with different things. It's an more interactive experience, and when you look at this movie, it's a very interactive experience because David is just sort of flitting from these moments and these people, but they all sort of come back into his life in different ways and change his life. I think also the image of memory throughout the film is really interesting, how David walks through his childhood, or how he stands behind his mother and Peggotty as they're cooing over him, and they have this sort of glittering light. Mm-hmm. And that image is repeated in the end.
That's one of the things that Hannah Field in her paper talks about, is that because these novels were intended for mixed age audiences, you have child characters who are really thinking and interacting with the story to the degree that a child could, and then you've got adult characters who are very clearly adult. And she points out that the third person narration acts as the mediator between those two audiences, which I think is really significant. And she points towards the juvenile versions of Charles Dickens' books that Mary Angela Dickens puts out as spending a lot more time explaining to a child audience why the characters are thinking what they think, and particularly why the child characters are thinking what they think. Mm-hmm. The other thing, you kind of bringing up the topic of literacy in this period. So not only is literacy increasing exponentially during this time, this is when the gap starts to be bridged between reading and writing. Because if you look in the scope of early modern history, you've got a far greater proportion, and it's not a large proportion of people who can read, but you've got a far greater proportion of people who can read compared to people who can write. And the fact that that gap is bridging, and the fact that writing is becoming more popular, the fact that someone born of the social status that Dickens was is able to write and is getting those skills is really significant in this time period. And we see that again mirrored through the movie, that you've got David Copperfield, who, despite spending a large portion of his childhood in the factories, is able to write a life story. It's really fascinating to have those kind of records exist that aren't top-down records.
I think that the way that this film does it, it's really a great film, and I wish that it was talked about more when it was released. And I guess sort of that's the issue of being a movie being released during a pandemic. I really wish that this film was talked about more. Unfortunately, IMDb's rating is pretty low, but Rotten Tomatoes is actually like 94%. And I think that the reason why it was sort of kept away is because, unfortunately, racism towards the cast, which upsets me because this was one of my favorite films of this year, and I feel like lots of people would enjoy it if it had been given the chance that it should have been given.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I feel like a lot of people feel like the really really awesome, inclusive casting that was done. I think that there's this kind of perception among people that, like, they shouldn't have done the casting they were due because somehow it's not historically accurate, and that's not correct at all. This movie portrays really, really well what England looked like in the Industrial Revolution. Like, we have to...
You're starting to see more in novels. There was actually this sort of interaction between cultures, and that there were people of color in England during this time, and that they were of many different social statuses. I think this film really does that really well. Sort of, you see that from Steerforth's mother to Agnes and David and a lot of the background characters as well, like David's friend group, all that. It actually looks like the way society, I think, was, and not like the BBC's whitewashed version of it, which it does a really big disservice because it's perpetuating a problem. Yeah, there's a really good romance novel, and I'm a romance novel enthusiast. Vanessa Riley, she did many years of research into this, and it's called The Duke, a Lady, and the Baby. And it shows how non-white people were living in the aristocracy. So people who are saying that this film is historically inaccurate because of its casting are not actually looking at things historically. They're looking at things racially.
Mm-hmm. Well, and when I first became aware that this movie came out, it was through Twitter. The tweet that I saw about it that kind of rose it to my attention was someone congratulating the film production and, I guess, the marketing team for that, for not making it a big deal that they had cast the people that they had. And I think that that's really significant, is the fact that this isn't the person of color version of David Copperfield. This is just an adaptation of David Copperfield. And I think that what you're talking about how we have kind of this vision of... I think that that's very true. I like this version.
They made the story, like, real in a way that I don't think people actually have treated Dickens novels or any sort of his classic literature in a long time.
This movie is a really good way of breaking some of the tropes that get assigned to historical fiction and then reinforce a false idea of historical fiction. But also, this movie is not a piece of historical fiction that disempowers any of the people that it plays with. Like, there's no human furniture in this film, which matters. Like, it really does.
It's so important.
Yeah. I think this... And I feel like this movie, and this could be partially due to just... I've watched more historical fiction lately, so I'm better at sussing it out. I feel like this movie does a better job of explaining class fluidity and explaining the troubles particular to each class, and the concerns of each class. Like, I feel like rather than it just being sort of a once you're upper class, you're hoity-toity, and that's all that matters, I think that this film does a lot better way of showing that with rapid industrialization, there were booms and there were busts and there were cycles that a person went through.
Mm-hmm. I think also it talks about how sort of accessibility to education can change the way you move through life. David, in this film, they make it clear that he is clearly dyslexic. I think that's really, really good that they're doing that. Like, that they're saying from the get-go, this character has dyslexia, and that does not define him, and he can still learn.
And that's actually something that I was hoping we'd get to in this conversation, because I know you're going to have some pretty well thought out ideas on it. So maybe we should just explain to the audience that we are shown through the eyes, through being held at his perspective and seeing words move about on a page. And it's very clearly shown that it's connected to him being anxious or stressed out, being demanded upon to perform in a certain way. In the original novel, My understanding is that there is kind of this allusion to him struggling with reading and writing. Am I correct on that?
I'm not really sure because I'm still sort of at the beginning of rereading the book, but I can say that in Bleak House, after doing some research, I learned that in Bleak House, Dickens did make one of the first really good images of dyslexia in a literary form, like one of the first images of it. So I think that was a later book.
Yes.
So I can't be really sure if there was any sort of allusions to it in David Copperfield. But Dickens has made it clear that dyslexia is a part of life in his novels.
Yeah. And I think whether or not it's explicitly stated in the novel, I think that there is a lot of power to be had in kind of reading between the lines and saying, well, in modern language, this is what it would be. And I think that makes the past a lot more relatable, but also, again, helps to just validate in our modern world. There's a lot of things that a certain side of the political spectrum will say are just happening now, or they're just sudden, and use that as a way to invalidate. So I think to read through the lines and be like, well, this character is struggling in school, this character describes an experience this way, and to be like, oh, this is probably what it is. This is probably now something that we have language for. It's always touchy to diagnose a historical figure with anything. Yeah. But to look at a character that's written, those character attributes didn't come from nowhere. Dickens worked with a lot of children. Dickens was around children a lot. Yeah. I have no doubt that he encountered children who today might be able to get that diagnosis.
Kind of like with Rick Riordan. He was a teacher, and his son had ADHD and dyslexia, so he made that story accessible to him by writing book series where those attributes were not treated as something that should be shunned.
Yes.
And I really liked that in this adaptation that David, he wasn't shunned for the fact that he has dyslexia. They made it clear that he's quite an avid storyteller, even by verbally. And that he writes constantly.
And the fact that it's shown and is part of a character, but the second it's introduced, it's not his defining characteristic. And the fact that it's not a story about resolution to his dyslexia, which there is absolutely nothing wrong with telling a story about overcoming something like that. But in terms of the story that the filmmakers adapted and the adaptation that came out of it, I'm glad that they just made it part of his experience and normalized it in that way.
I'm glad they did too. And sometimes, like, from dyslexia comes out in different ways, like reading aloud, and that's gonna sometimes be difficult for talking when you've got dyslexia and other stuff. But I like the way that they just made it normal. Like, I think that that's the way that we should treat stuff like that in film and TV, like learning disabilities or physical disabilities. We should just make it normal. It shouldn't be like a big thing that a person has a disability in film or TV. It should just be normal. Yeah. I really like the way that they treated Mr. Dick.
I liked Mr. Dick. He was cool.
I thought he was amazing. Like, that they didn't treat him as, like, a crazy person. Like, David, I think, with his dyslexia, he understood Mr. Dick and the fact that he's got all these thoughts in his head.
And I wasn't actually sure how we were supposed to read Mr. Dick or how he's coded.
Yeah.
But I do think that in a lot of adaptations, he would have been portrayed a lot more kind of silly manic or portrayed as being mad. But the fact that he is at no point shown as being a problem for that is really good. And again, like the film is in no way rewriting history, or the film is in no way changing. Like, the film is not taking liberties. What the film is doing is showing that, much like today, you can't have every element of someone create drama. Mr. Dick is still accepted. He's still a person. So I'm glad that they didn't portray him negatively. They just portrayed him as different.
I honestly liked the way that they treated him because he's still intelligent, he's still smart. He just has difficulties with his mental health, and I think that people in the past, like, they would probably treat him, I haven't seen any other David Copperfield adaptations, but I feel like they would have probably not treated him like with the kind of respect. I feel like right now, with the understandings of mental health that are like rising in the world around us, that
at no point is anyone adverse to interacting with Mr. Dick.
yes,
Like, yes, you can tell from watching the scenery that he is a little bit, he's a little bit socially awkward, but no one is ever rude to him. And I think that that is a good portrayal. And also, I just think it's more realistic. Like, we really like to hype the Victorians as being dramatic. Like, it would be exhausting. And I'm in no way suggesting that Victorian responses to mental health weren't at times incredibly inhumane.
I agree.
Like, I am not in any way trying to say that the past was rosy or any of that. But I think that a film like this introduces more nuance into people's understanding of the past. That's what it boils down to, is this film has nuance. This film shows that there are social problems, but doesn't... Often we talk about the past and social problems of the past in such a way that we make them seem so backwards that it should have from the get-go been obvious that these things were wrong. And that narrative is teleological. It only serves to allow us to pat ourselves on the back and say, isn't it great that we're not like that anymore? When you bring nuance to the past and you bring the social forces into understandings of the past, and you understand why it was, why we've moved away from it, and where we are now, you allow us to continue to get better. Because we're not sitting there being like, oh, we're so much better than we were before. We're done.
I really like this adaptation for that. I appreciate it, honestly. I think that the way that David treated Mr. Dick was really, really beneficial. Like, he wasn't calling him crazy or treating him anything like... He treated him like he was a person, that he wasn't odd for having these thoughts of Charles II. Like, tries to help his friend by doing the kite, which I think is really sweet.
Yeah, that's honestly summer quarantine activity. Make a kite with a bunch of quotes on it. I'm going to be using the primary sources for my independent study, which was a bunch of court records on disorderly behaviors in alehouses in the 17th century, sorry. Yeah.
Can I do that with you?
Yeah, we can do that together.
Can we just have a kite
when
flying?
We're allowed to
Yes.
have outdoor social interactions again, we'll do that.
We'll do that. I have never flown a kite before, so I think that would be fun.
My SO hasn't flown a kite either. What? How?
Is there something with military kids and, like, us not knowing how to fly a kite?
God, it might be. It might be. That or, like...
Which is funny, because I had, like, the biggest perfect field for that.
Huh. Maybe it's a military family thing. This is gonna be the first thing I ask anyone whose parents are in the military. They'll be like, yeah, my mom was in the military. Have you ever flown a kite? And just no explanation. So, if you're listeners, help us out. Leave a comment. Tell us if you've flown a kite before, and if your family's military.
It's for science. Yes. Or, wait, even I can make a poll on our Twitter.
We could do that.
And, they can fill it in.
We'll do that after the episode comes out, or Facebook.
Yes, we'll do that afterwards.
Just out of curiosity. Maybe we'll do shoutouts if people comment, too. We'll have to figure that out.
Yeah. If you leave a review on Apple Podcasts, we'll be sure to leave a shout out as well. It really helps us get out there. I think that there should be more adaptations like the personal history of David Copperfield. I feel like I loved this film so much, and I wasn't even gonna talk about the costumes or the cinematography, because I feel like that would just be taking way too long. I thought they were beautiful. I thought the sets were great. I think that the way they treated social history, mental health, education, the way that they treated it in this film was really refreshing and healthy. I wish that people actually went towards it and didn't just balk at it because of the way it was casted. Because, like, I think it can best be seen, like, in the way that it's been just reviewed on IMDb and the difference between that and Rotten Tomatoes. Rotten Tomatoes, like, it's got a 94% fresh rating, and then it's treated as 6.4% on IMDb, and I think that shows, like, how people are just fearing it because of race, which is an issue. And it's one that I'm upset about.
Yeah, I think part of it could also be just the general interest in historical fiction. That's certainly a component that we have to keep in mind too, is not everybody goes out for that. As we said at the beginning of this recording, I said no to Christmas Carol. And, you know, I quite often don't gravitate towards historical fiction that's specifically based off of classic literature because I find that those stories have been around so much that they're not doing the legwork to actually try and make historical fiction. They're making a fairy tale. And I felt like this film adaptation really avoided a fairy tale.
Yes, I appreciate for that. I read a lot of historical novels. Like, for a future podcast episode, I've been reading a constant amount of romance novels, and let me tell you, there's a lot of fiction retellings. Some of them I don't really enjoy. Give me something more interesting. I think that what David Copperfield does is because it hasn't been adapted as much as things like Great Expectations or A Christmas Carol, even though I love A Christmas Carol so much to the point where it's probably annoying.
I do not, and you can come at me, ghosts.
I am a ghost and I'll attack. No, just kidding. No. I think we hope that we've convinced you all how interesting this film is, or at least piqued your interest a little bit in it. I think it is such a good adaptation, and I think that we should be seeing more like it in the future, tackling classic novels like David Copperfield in a way that actually looks at the history of the book when it was written and the person behind it, allows for a really accessible adaptation, because this story feels very fun. I feel like anyone who doesn't normally gravitate to a period drama might enjoy this a lot.
Accessibility is the perfect way to put it. This is a fun family film, without a doubt, but it is also accessible. It's well done. Yeah, honestly.
It's got a lot of nuance to it. It's a really, really well-acted, well-cast film.
There's no Muppets in this one, guys. You should just watch it.
We would like to acknowledge that MacEwan University, this podcast, and all the content we create are located and produced on Treaty 6 territory. This land was traditionally and continues to be a home, place of gathering, and meeting ground for many Indigenous people. This includes the Nakota Sioux, Nitsitapi, Métis, Saulteaux, and Cree First Nations.
Yeah, so you've found our podcast. That's a great first step. Proud of you all.
Yes, thank you.
If you happen to be listening on a friend's device, you can find us in the future on all your favorite podcast directories. We're on Apple, we're on Spotify, we're on Anchor. We're pretty easy to find.
I'm gonna try to get onto YouTube eventually.
Eventually, cool. We're on Twitter. Our username is @hist@mac. On Instagram, we are history@mac. And on Facebook, just search up the Interdisciplinary History Group. We will also leave all those links in the description below, because, let's face it, you're not going to get it from me saying it. I'll also have links to the articles that I referenced, which are all available through the MacEwan Library. A couple of them were open source too. If you want to get in touch with us, either to work with us on a future episode or to just suggest an episode topic, please let us know by shooting us an email, which is also in the description below. Thanks so much for listening to us. It's been a very exciting start to, I guess not start, but we've been doing this about 3 months, and the calendar is about to change, so we feel like we have to thank you for... Not that we have to. We feel like we ought to thank you guys who have been listening for listening so far. We've got a lot of exciting stuff coming in the new year, and yeah.
I'm just gonna say, we would really appreciate it if you took the time to share our podcast with your friends and family if you have the chance, or please leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It is so important, and it helps us a lot, and it helps get into touch with new people in ways that we hadn't. Once again, thank you for all listening to us so far. I'm so happy we're doing this, Sloan. I'm so happy that we're having these conversations, and it's a lot of fun. I enjoy it. So I hope you've all had a wonderful holiday, and hopefully this new year is going to be so much better than 2020, because God, that was a dumpster fire of a year.